if you want to genuinely write proper history of, you know, communities and societies and peoples, you know, you can't just write about men. You know, you can't pretend, oh well, we don't need to write about the women because there weren't so many of them. So I'm Louise Miskell. I'm a professor of history at Swansea University, and I specialise in teaching British modern history, but my own research is specifically on the history of the steel industry in Wales. I think women have had a much overlooked role actually in the steel industry, especially in Wales, where women were employed in large numbers, in their thousands actually, in the tin plate industry going back to the start of the 20th century, doing quite manual work, quite physical work. When that industry was automated in the 1950s, a lot of the jobs they had been doing became obsolete, and they weren't subsequently re-employed in the new all singing, all dancing automated mills at Trostre and Velindre. So, you know, ironically, I think numbers of women employed in the industry is probably reduced over time, partly because of that. A lot of the time, the jobs they were doing were, you know, they weren't the high profile, they weren't the kind of leadership roles, and they, you know, they didn't leave a lot of trace sometimes of, you know, they weren't sort of heading up trade unions and things like that. But what I do think is really interesting and important is the fact that their presence in the industry, the female tin plate worker, if we can think of that figure as a kind of generic symbol of women in the steel industry, that figure has been sort of immortalised in public art. There's an amazing sculpture in the middle of Llanelli which depicts a female tin plate worker actually separating tin plate sheets, wearing the protective gear, using the tool, doing that job. And to my knowledge, that's the only example anywhere in Britain of a representation in public art of a working female steelworker. And I think we should be quite proud that that is in South Wales, and that, you know, is on our doorstep really. And it does say something very significant to me about just how central women have been to the story of steel in this particular region. So that would be my inspiring woman. You'd maybe say she's not a real alive woman, she's a generic representation, but it stands for all those thousands of women who did that job over decades. I grew up locally. I was born in Baglan, lived in Port Talbot most of my adult life, in or around. So I've seen like the industry change over the last sort of 40-50 years, and obviously being an historian of steel makes me reflect a lot on where we are now compared to what the past has been. So when I think about the future, one thing that always comes to mind, you know, for me is how adaptable and how willing to embrace change steelworkers in Port Talbot have been over decades. I mean, you know, the industry has gone through so many technological transformations, the introduction of computers, you know, the beginnings of automated strip mill technology in the 50s, the closure of all the, you know, the localised hand mills. And, you know, at each of those stages, people have adapted, people have kind of embraced change and found ways to carry on and grow and improve the industry. And I think what's happening now, you know, is really important for our future as a, you know, as a green economy. You know, we have to move away from carbon-based fuels. We know the damage that does to the planet. And, you know, this gives us an opportunity to do that. Women are very good, actually, at dealing with change. They're often on the front line when there are big upheavals, you know, during periods of war. They get sort of, you know, requisitioned into workforces to fill gaps, to do jobs that traditionally they haven't had opportunities to do. And I think also at times of technological change, which is where we are at the moment, transitioning from blast furnace steelmaking to electric arc furnace, you know, the process of making steel is going to change. It's something new. It's opening up new doors. In some ways, that gives an opportunity to people who maybe haven't filled lots of jobs in that particular part of the steelmaking process to think, well, maybe now's the time for me to step into that. So, you know, economic, technological change can actually present opportunities for new groups and new, you know, for the order of things to change in the workforce. And I think if that opens more doors for women, that can only be a good thing. I think looking ahead, I think there's a responsibility, you know, obviously I work in a university in the education sector, there's a responsibility on people like me to, you know, get the message across to the people I teach that, you know, the steel industry is not a male-only domain, that, you know, there is a place for women and has historically always been a place for women in that industry. So that's part of how I see my job. But also from the point of view of the workplace, you know, workplaces, if they're going to be welcoming and inclusive of different demographic groups, then they have to provide spaces, they have to provide facilities, equipment that women as well as men can use, and they have to kind of make sure that you know, women who work in steel don't feel marginalised and don't feel, you know, like they're a minority group, you know, that this is normal and this is kind of the way it should be. The industry does have such a male-dominated stereotype about it. You know, we think of metalworking traditionally as being a very masculine kind of role. If you want to genuinely write proper history of, you know, communities and societies and peoples, you know, you can't just write about men. You know, you can't pretend, oh, well, we don't need to write about the women because there weren't so many of them. You know, if you want to tell the full story, you know, you've got to open your eyes, you've got to look at, you know, what people were doing and the realities. And I think, you know, women's presence has been a really important ongoing part of steel industry history in this part of Britain. And, you know, I want to tell people about that and I want people to understand that.